What are random encounters in Dungeons and Dragons? That's what we're going to explore in this vlog from the perspective of the player, from the perspective of the dungeon master, and from the perspective of a tool where can we use it to support the narrative of the game? Or is it something that in this current edition of D&D, compared to previous editions of D&D, random encounters, random monsters, wandering monster tables, that's a relic of the past. Let's just kind of put that on the shelf with THAC0 and other aspects of the game and how it used to operate. So the idea with random encounters is at certain points in the adventure, based on what the players are doing, if they're not doing something specific in that moment, you roll on a table to see if something happens. And usually that table, although it's random, will pull in flavor, will pull in narrative from the game itself, from the adventure itself. A perfect example would be if the players are exploring a swamp, right, looking for a kind of a lost city in a swamp, there will be a random table of monsters. And it might be like 1d10, it might be more nuanced, 1d20. It's going to pull monsters from the local area, right? The type of things that you might fight, you might encounter, you might discover in a swamp. And that table's utilized by the DM. If the players rest for the night, you would roll on this table to see, does something wandering come along? And it's not hidden information from the players. They're aware that something could potentially happen. In this perspective, it creates a little bit of, in a good way, it creates a little bit of tension. There's this idea the party's maybe a little bit beat up, or maybe they don't want to burn some spells. They want to rest. They set a watch. There's a risk. You're like in this swamp looking for the lost city. There's other monsters wandering around. One might wander in. So the DM rolls. It's exciting anytime the dice roll. It might lead to an encounter. It might lead to nothing. It adds the potential for a little bit of navigation and consequence in utilizing that. We also see random encounters where perhaps as you're exploring hexes, so this idea, if we've got a wilderness map, we're in the swamp, we've got some hexes, maybe the players have a map with a couple of potential markings. It might be like for every 5 units that they move, and a unit could be an hour, it could be a day, you roll to see if there's a random encounter. So again, this idea of creating a more living, interactive type world, and it leads to an encounter. Now, pulling in, right, if I go back to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, there's all sorts of tables and random stuff and see what happens. And it was never balanced. It was never intended to be balanced. The perfect example was one of the random encounter tables for a city type environment. So the idea is if you're wandering the city at night, there is the potential to run into something, to deal with something. It encourages the players not to be out at night, but also there are certain adventures where you want to be out at night to deal with a plot hook or just kind of sneak up on an estate or deal with whatever you're going to deal with. Those encounter tables are just bonkers. Even now when I look at them, they're bonkers. They're a lot of fun. They're the type of thing where, okay, you're wandering the city at night. DM is like, it's 2 a.m., nobody's on the city streets. I'm going to roll a 100, D100, 2D10, see what we get. Looks on the table, random encounter. You're like, okay, makes sense, right? We're wandering around the city. Could be some giant rats. Could be some thugs. Could be city guard. Could be a vampire lord. You're like, wait, vampire lord? What? Like, there was an encounter where we were like maybe 4th level, something like that, 3rd or 4th level, which in AD&D is a solid type accomplishment. There's no baby cakes. There's no CR rating, challenge this, challenge that. It's fair. The players always win. Like crazy stuff happens. You've always got to be looking for an out in AD&D. And the DM rolled, and it's like a vampire lord accompanied by a ghoul pack. And we're like, wait, what? How do we even deal with this? Thief in the party's trying to calculate XP. He's thinking like, well, I mean, we're kind of in trouble. Have I been spotted? And what's like the initiative order? Can I like maybe pickpocket the vampire and just, because we're going to run for it anyway. Like, let's see what happens. So from that perspective, it draws in. I think random encounter tables, if they reflect more the nuance of the adventure itself in that challenge rating, they can be potentially useful. Now, on the opposite side, rolling on the random tables for the sake of random to randomly see what random stuff is going to happen, that's a drag on the game. There were some older modules where like you were always rolling on random tables for wandering monsters, for random encounters. Yes, as a DM, you could choose not to use it. Certainly at any point, you could say, I'm not going to utilize this. And there have been some adventures that I just don't use the tables at all. The challenge here is, does it break the game in that it interjects stuff that takes away from completing the adventure? Meaning, if we have 2 hours to play and 1/3 is dealing with random encounters, okay, you're getting the experience points. Maybe you're getting some quickly generated treasure, some gold, but we're taking away from the narrative. And you're like, another random encounter? So utilizing it from that perspective, I tend to use them less often these days, unless it's an old school type game where you have to realize you're going out into the wilderness, you're going out into the city at night. There is that potential for it and how to navigate it. But even then, I'm careful to realize I'm not going to roll like every 10 minutes real game time to see what happens, because that's going to take away from the game. It's going to break the immersion. It's going to break the narrative. And it's doing the opposite of the very thing that it's trying to do. So from the perspective of a DM, how often do you use wandering monsters, random encounters? Do you regularly use them in an adventure when the players rest or kind of enter a new area? Or is it the type of thing that you really don't use? You're looking and saying, it's there, I understand it, but we have regular encounters. We have the regular script. We have the regular adventures to utilize.